and again, back to the role of comedy. What does it do for you up there? Or did you always know you want to do comedy?
Always. I always knew I wanted to do it. I mean, my parents noticed, like, because I was born in 1971. So when SNL started, I was very young, but my parents saw that I just was transfixed, and they noticed right away that I became obsessed with Steve Martin.
Oh.
And so my parents, being the cool parents they were, started like, well, he likes this stuff. So they started giving me Steve Martin records, like they let me watch Richard Pryor. Like they had no content restrictions really as far as comedy went. And so they fed it. And my dad had a VHS player very early on. So he would record all the comedy specials. And I just
a little bit of porn.
Devoured Skinamax. Just a little bit of Skinamax. Just a little bit of Red Shoe Diaries.
But back to Pryor.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on him through the retrospectoscope, looking back at Pryor?
Well, one of the things that was so incredible, I mean, like there were so many things that were so incredible about him, but especially when you kind of look at what the 80s comedy boom became, which is, the comedy boom, I think really was from like 74 to like 92. There were 18 years of like comedy is king. And there were a million comedy shows on in the 80s, but they all started kind of bred, because people were getting famous off of a Tonight Show set. Yeah. So it was like people had sort of their quick identity, jokey jokes, whatever. There were a lot of great comics. And Pryor, the magic of Pryor was that in the 70s, he was so autobiographical.
Yes.
And he talked about things, you're coming out of the 60s where everything's still squeaky clean. You're sort of coming out of the, the Dick Van Dyke era, the Bewitched era, the I Love Lucy era. And so here's Richard Pryor. You have Richard Pryor, you have Norman Lear, you have Saturday Night Live. And it's almost this like punk rock movement in comedy where it's like, we're talking about real shit. And Richard Pryor, he talked about his drug addiction. He talked about his heart attack. He talked about catching on fire.
I challenge anybody to go listen to this, not just his set, but go listen to his stories.
Yeah.
And the characters, Tulum and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to tell you something. That's not just comedy. It's poetry.
It is poetry.
It's poetry.
It is poetry.
It is as relevant and powerful any moment you listen to it as when it was when he first did.
And so you look at all the super comics of the 70s and you see like, Carlin was really kind of the like society's critic.
Yeah.
And Steve Martin, who he was my number one. His comedy was all about satire of comedy.
Yeah.
But it worked on two levels because if you didn't get that he was satirizing like a Vegas comic, they were still dopey, funny bits.
Right.
And he wrote bits that were funny and you couldn't always necessarily explain why, but you were laughing. And, I got to see him perform live when I was a kid. And so.
Have you read Born Standing?
Yeah, Born Standing Up. I listened to the audio version because he reads it.
Oh, wow.
So when he's talking about the old bits, he does them again. And it's phenomenal. Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal.
I went to that theater at Knott's Berry Farm where he performed for many years.
Oh yeah,
right around the time he was there. I wonder if I saw him. It's so
you
weird.
Might have. Yeah,
I was in like junior high school or something, and I remember going there, and I remember watching the melodramas that he talks about in that book.
It's very possible, but I also think, from the standpoint of the comic, I think there's therapy and processing and defense mechanism. From the standpoint of the audience, a comedy show is I describe it as a flash community. You are basically setting up a community in an hour and a half and all coming together just for that moment.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's something I've not heard somebody say, but I think is right, which is you're creating connections with yourself and the audience and amongst the audience, right?
That's right.
It's like you become this flowing sea of people that are connected.
That's right.
And my question to you is, though, when you were depressed and whatever was going on there, what was different? What was missing? What was the problem?
You mean like when I was still drinking and stuff?
Yeah,
what was the problem?
Sort of hit a bottom somewhere. And what was that?
I don't know. It's just, the thing that can be so, as you know, creepily insidious about addiction is that it's so progressive that it just happens before you even realize, because you start doing it when you're young and it's like, oh, it's fun. It's fun. And at a certain point, it shifts to like, oh, this isn't just fun. You need to do this to survive, and you've set it up that way. And I don't know when that shift happened. I mean, I know that, I was like the majority of my drinking. I mean, I drank a lot, but I did happen to be in New York during 9/11, and I kind of got stuck there. I was supposed to go back and forth. I was doing this ridiculous dating show called Shipmates, and I was supposed to fly back and forth to New York every other week to shoot the host wraps. So I was on a plane at like an American Airlines LAX flight at JFK, and then the pilot came. We hadn't taken off, and the pilot came out, and he said, "I don't know how to say this, but 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center," and people didn't even have a frame of reference for what that was.
I remember how confusing.
But I remember turning and looking out the window and seeing the billows of smoke, and that whole day was, I mean, like for everyone, you know, and. I mean, obviously, I don't think I need to set up how horrible, but what it meant was that I didn't travel back and forth to LA every other week. So I basically just stayed in New York, and I was so, you know, I felt so displaced. I didn't really know anyone there. And so the thing that I had was that I just drank a lot because it, you know,
was your only friend.
It was when you're drinking, you're controlling your feelings. Yeah. And so that for me,
I know you.
So that's where it really took off, like the 2001 to 2003.
Here's my thing on you. I know you to be an extremely kind person and worried about everybody else, harsh on yourself.
Of course. I mean, of course, I'm harsh on myself.
I'm imagining that something was going on where you were beating yourself up about that time too.
I mean, listen, I'm sure that like if we're really digging back there, I'm sure there are things like, you know, when you see your parents argue a lot and you can't help and you don't, you know, it's like kids.
So shame and guilt.
We don't have our brains aren't formed to be able to process those big adult
but you leave those things with shame.
I guess so, shame.
Yeah.
And we also, because we moved a lot, I was usually the new kid at school, so I was always trying to fit in.
Is that where the funny came in too? Entertain the kids, be funny?
Absolutely. And also because I got bullied a lot as a little kid because I was into, you know, in the early 80s, I was into Dungeons and Dragons and computers and video games and things that it wasn't like it is now.
How interesting you converted that into that was a sentinel part of your career.
Well, that's right. I mean, and that's when my career changed, is when I stopped chasing what I thought other people in the business wanted me to be and trying to fit into other jobs and saying like, I'm not even going to audition for this other kind of stuff. I only like these things and I'm only going to pursue these things because they make me happy. Because we spend so much of our lives chasing things that we think will make us happy instead of just being happy or doing things that or just
make you happy.
Or it's the idea of making as opposed to just being. And
what's interesting to me is that being the nerd is what got you bullied and then made you successful.
But which is kind of a nice payback for all the shit that I went through when I was a kid. So having gone through that, having, you know, getting stuffed in a trash can because I was on my way to chess club and getting, you know, like kicked around. And I was a very small kid.
Chess.
I had to do PE with the grades that were younger than me. Yeah, it was like that kind of thing. So, you know, so I'm sure there's a lot of defense mechanism because of that.
That's the comedy, everybody. There it is.
And I have to tell you, I'm so thankful that I grew up that way because it, to me, I think forced me to be introspective at a young age.
Yeah.
And I think kids who are very popular at a young age don't ever learn to go beyond themselves in that way. And so they, like, it's crazy.
Although a lot of people that had harsh childhoods use comedy a little bit like a sword. I think Corolla doing that. I think Ralphie May kind of did that.
Sure.
Did you ever use it as a... I don't think you do though. I don't ever hear you using it.
I don't like to attack. I you know, and times, of course, every comic kind of goes through a little bit of that phase.
But sometimes it's the word killing. I go out and I killed.
Right.
I sometimes think that for some comedians, there's like a real aggressive meaning.
Well, there's definitely a dragon that they're slaying.
Right, exactly.
But I remember like when I was doing Chelsea Lately all the time, at a certain point, I started to feel really bad because I was just talking shit about people that I didn't really know.
No, I know that's not you.
And Whitney Cummings gave me some amazing advice where I said, I feel so guilty. And she goes, you know what? When I feel that way, I just put the joke on myself. And I was like, you're brilliant. Of course I should be putting the joke on myself, not on other people. And so I don't like to use humor to make other people feel bad.
Oh, no.
So it's just not me. And
I know that's not you. There's nothing about you unkind. That's what I know about
But I definitely think that with comedy, there's some like, look at me, give me attention. If I get attention, I'll get validation. If I get validation, I'm worth something. If I get, you know, and so it's sort of learning to do comedy because it's learning to do anything because it's fun and because you choose to, not because you need to. And that's a very subtle, but I think profound distinction.